So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here this afternoon for the HESS Consortium webinar about generating revenue through IP address sales. I'm Brian Bowdy. I'm Chief Information Officer at Queen's University of Charlotte. To set some context, we're a private university with about 2,200 FTE students, undergrad and graduate, and we started our journey a couple of years ago looking at potentially selling some of our IP addresses, and benefited from a lot of the experience and expertise of other colleges who had gone before us, started looking at a number of different opportunities for selling, including brokers, and through that met Jake and Brander Group and was very impressed with the service they offer, and forged a relationship between Brander Group and HESS Consortium that is now in its second full year, and has really benefited a number of our member institutions to the tune of, Jake, are we in the $4 million+ range of revenue generated for HESS schools now?
Yeah, 4 and climbing. We just brought on actually 2 other schools in the last this week actually.
Great. Yeah. So that's been a really successful partnership. So I'll let Jake introduce himself, and we also have Todd Norris from St. Mary's College in Indiana, who recently completed a couple of different IP sales, and he's going to share his experience as well. So Todd and Jake.
Sure, I'll just do a quick intro. My name is Jake. I started Brander Group about 5 years ago. I've been in network and infrastructure for about 15 years, and we kind of do everything from a connectivity standpoint and cloud standpoint for customers and data center. And we just saw a huge influx of needs for IPv4 in 2015, and decided to really take a really deep dive into this market and realized how difficult it was to do this, and how much room there was in the market for growth, and the necessity for somebody that knew what they were doing. So that's why we got into this. Is we saw that there was a lot of a lot of need, and we could kind of facilitate the transfer of assets between buyers and sellers and make their lives easier. And we've grown tremendously over the years. Just to give you guys an idea of scale, last year we were the biggest provider for transfers globally. We did about 480 transfers and the tune of $50 million globally. So the market has grown tremendously over the last 3 to 4 years, and everybody that's kind of looking at it now is going to have a nice entrance into the market, and to be able to capitalize while the prices are the highest they've ever been. So thank you guys for having me on here, and I'll join. Oops, shoot.
Yeah, just real quick. So my name's Todd Norris, Chief Information Officer at St. Mary's College. We started walking down this road, started having some conversation about it. Maybe a little more than a year ago, I talked with Brian a little bit at the HESS Consortium conference, and then kind of tabled it for a while. And as need arose, came back and revisited the conversation, and I'm here today. I'm just going to share my case study. I'll do that a little bit later, so I'll save that for a later time, but looking forward to the conversation, and I think it's good. I think it could really move the needle on your campuses, so happy to participate. Thanks for the invite, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Todd. So what we're going to look through during the hour that we've got, why you might consider selling. What about leasing? Is that an option? That's something that I was particularly interested in. Maintain ownership of the asset, but leasing it out to generate the revenue. What would that look like? How much can you make? And we'll talk through some real dollar examples there. What the process is to go through. Is it really possible to generate the kinds of revenue that we're talking about? And yes, it is. And then we'll have time at the end for any questions, and share our contact information. And as we're going through each topic, feel free to ask any questions out loud or in the chat as we go through. No need to save those till the end if you've got something that's timely as we talk through it. So why would you consider selling IP addresses? The first and most obvious is it really is an opportunity if you have a significant allocation of IP addresses, as many institutions do, then it's a real opportunity to generate really significant revenue from an asset that's otherwise unused. And you can then use that revenue to fund strategic technology initiatives. We know even more so now than in normal times. The funding for those strategic initiatives is really difficult for a lot of institutions, and this is a way to use a technology asset to fund strategic technology growth, which I know Todd and I have both done at our institutions. Jake mentioned previously, now is a really strong time in the market, so you can monetize those assets while the market is very strong. And it's really important to note that it really is, there are lots of companies out there, both cloud scale, massive providers, and also small businesses who are looking to do activities online. And again, even more so in the world we're in now, there's a real need for additional IPv4 addresses, and many colleges and universities have those and are not using them. And there are companies and organizations who have a real need for those assets. So what about leasing? Bottom line up front, leasing's a bad idea. and I looked pretty deeply, as I said, into the opportunity to lease, thinking that it could be a kind of best of both worlds scenario of capturing a significant amount of revenue, but then still maintaining ownership, so that if we need to use those in the future, or if the price really goes up and I then still have the asset to sell later, and those are real advantages. Unfortunately, the disadvantages are really significant, and in my estimation, far outweigh what the advantages are. The difficulty of a transaction and the operation of leasing those is really significant, and especially because everything that happens in that IP range that you might be leasing to somebody else is your responsibility. So lots of nefarious activities that can happen online, lots of companies that might be doing disreputable things that you don't want your institution's ownership of that asset to be associated with. And it's very difficult to control that. Once you lease that to a provider, they can then sublease to somebody else, or they can change their business model and use it for different purposes. So that's really the biggest downside. And it's the difference between slow revenue that you could generate from leasing versus a significant one-time recognition of that revenue from selling. And potentially, it's like the stock market, like anything else. It's impossible to forecast perfectly the market. It doesn't appear that it's going to be slowing down anytime soon, but the value could decrease in coming years. So you could lease now, and then at the end of a lease term, find that the market price for addresses has dropped. What's really going to precipitate that pricing is how quickly organizations and companies move from IPv4, which is the IP standard that we're all used to the newer IPv6 that has significantly more capacity in addressing. But that's a really significant undertaking to make that transition from IPv4 to IPv6. Once it happens, those IPv4 addresses become much less valuable. And it's a judgment call for anybody who has that asset to sell to determine, do we think that those addresses are going to become more valuable in the future, less valuable in the future? How valuable is that revenue that we can generate now in selling versus potential future revenue? But as we looked at that ledger of advantages and disadvantages with leasing, it didn't take me long to reach the conclusion that leasing was a very difficult scenario to undertake, and it's I think a very uncommon one for those reasons. So getting to the real nitty gritty of what revenue might look like. So very often universities will have been assigned back in the early 90s in the nomenclature of IP addresses, a /16 block of addresses, which is a little over 65,000 IP addresses. And you can use this link on the ARIN website. ARIN is the association that manages IP addressing in our part of the world. You can use this site to search your institution or your IP range to determine how many addresses are assigned to your organization. There are a lot of universities and colleges that all got a full /16 block. In other cases, you might have gotten a smaller block of addresses, or I know some schools who are using IP addresses from their ISP rather than having addresses issued in their university's name. So not always the case that a university will have their own IP addresses or will have a full /16 block, but many colleges and universities, regardless of size, did receive that full allocation back, in 1992, 1993, when IP addresses were virtually infinite, and it was just easier administratively to just give everybody a big allocation. So for example, in North Carolina, where I am, 152.1.0.0 all the way through 152.1.255.255, that block of addresses belongs to NC State University. 152.2 belongs to University of North Carolina. 152.3 belongs to Duke University, and on and on and on as they went down the list of schools and colleges. So if you have that allocation of 65,000 addresses and you decide to sell, call it half of those, which would be selling around 32,000 addresses, which is what we've done. And Todd's very similar. He sold a handful of additional ones, but pretty much half. Or if you sell 48,000 of those, which is selling 3/4 of those, and then that would leave you with 16,000 additional addresses. So half of the allocation is a /17 block, 32,000, and then an additional /18, which is 16,000. You sell both of those blocks, and let's say you net $20 per address, which is probably a little bit on the low side right now, but similar to that, then you'd be looking at generating somewhere between $640,000 and almost $1 million in those sales. And as Jake mentioned earlier, with the HESS partnership with Brander Group, our institutions have generated more than $4 million in revenue in the last year and change. So the revenue opportunity is a very real one, and I know has been really helpful and advantageous for a lot of our members. So what does the process look like? And I'll kind of talk through at a high level, and then give an opportunity for any questions anybody has, and then Jake will share some more specific details about what that process looks like. So this is what we did. I think it's very similar to what Todd has done and many others. So the first step is for the campus to move all of your IP addressing into your future smaller IP range. So in our case, we had our block of 65,000 IP addresses, and most of our most critical services, our data center and our core network and the things that would have been the most difficult to move, were mostly clustered within the front half of our address space. So they were close to that kind of 0.0 part of the IP range. We had things spread all throughout the range, but more of the things were in the front half, and especially more of the critical things like the data center, like the core network, were especially in that front half of our IP range. So we identified what things do we have in that IP space in the back half of our range, those last 32,000 addresses, and we made a plan for where we were going to move those residence hall Wi-Fi networks, those printers. I think we had an HVAC control server. That was one of the more difficult things that we had to move, but we made our plan and moved any of those IP addresses from the second half of our range and moved those things within the capacity that we had available in the first half of our range. Simultaneous with that, we also developed our plan for how we would use that revenue because we wanted to avoid, as I'm sure you can all understand why, showing up with a significant amount of revenue and no plan to spend that, and then that may become an attractive target for other university needs. A lot of schools that I've talked with have used this for one-time infrastructure needs, new data center hardware, new core network hardware, new residence hall Wi-Fi, new big purchases like that. Others have used that for seed money for a big project like an ERP migration. We're using it for kind of a hybrid of those, a number of infrastructure things, some other software and cloud service pieces, and put together a program in a kind of strategic planning mindset of here are things that we need to move the university forward. We haven't had other funding for it. Here's how we propose to use all of that revenue. And I absolutely recommend gain approval for that plan, get buy-in from across the other senior leaders at your institution and get approval for that before making the sale. Have those dollars spent and allocated before that revenue comes in. What the broker will do as you're working with a broker to do that is confirm your IP address range. Jake and his team have a suite of tools to confirm any addresses that might be blacklisted, any addresses that might not have clear records in terms of ownership and ability to transfer. And they have relationships with a network of reputable, qualified buyers who are ready to buy these addresses. So they'll make that match to find a buyer. The Brander Group also works to, excuse me, to work through the full transaction and all of the steps in it that Jake will talk about here shortly to see all of that through in a timely manner. We did a few different sales. I think Todd did. It looks like a few different sales, and both of those I think have worked really well for us. And then finally, the fun part is after you complete that transaction, receive funding for that sale, then you get to use that revenue for the intended purpose and bring those improvements that we all want to do for our campuses that you can use that revenue for. So before I hand off to Jake, I'm just going to take an intentional pause and ask after that, all that information, what questions might anybody have at this point before we get deeper into the weeds? Okay, very good. Jake.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. Well done as usual. So let's see here. All right, part of what we do here is it's education, and part of the education is ensuring that each school understands all the work that's involved within the process. And then the other part of what we do is we actually kind of execute on most of those initiatives that are required in order to make this transaction occur. So before we even get into that whole process, there's a little bit of work involved. So when we confirm the asset ownership, it doesn't really apply to schools as much, but there have been instances where two schools kind of joined or merged, and there was some work involved where we needed to provide Aaron with specific documentation that showed which school was a successor. So that's something that we take on and kind of alleviate the stress of having your attorneys try to figure out exactly what's going on. We take on all that work with you and kind of guide you through that process. As Brian mentioned, we've got an internal tool that's proprietary. Basically, it pings every single IP address against over 100 global blacklists, and then it spits out a report, much like a Carfax report. The significance of this report is it allows us to create a high level of transparency between you guys who are selling the block and the potential buyer who wants to know that the IPs are blacklisted or not blacklisted. And if they are blacklisted in any way, we actually have support on how to clean them up, and we'll engage with your team to ensure that the IPs are clean. So it creates transparency and also allows us to kind of increase the value of the IPs to ensure that we get the most out of that. Something important I think to note is we help you guys with readdressing. I find that often everybody in their addressing strategy will, not everybody, most people will think that they have to move everything to like the first, the .1 block, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what we always try to do is help you create a strategy based around kind of your specific situation. Sometimes it's better to move everything to the middle, right? If all your core infrastructure and everything that's required is in the middle, no need to move everything to the front. So we like to sit down with you pre-readdressing, just find out exactly what's going on and help you guys create that strategy before you start to undertake maybe what could be a year's worth of work. So this is a fully managed service. We provide all the legal documentation required to sell an asset such as this. And then we facilitate the entire transfer process and purchasing process from start to finish. Much like a real estate transaction, we guide you through every step of the way. So there's no questions involved, and anything that arises, our team will actually will engage with, and then also make sure that it kind of gets handled. So you're never really left alone trying to figure out what's going on. And then, as Brian mentioned, we've got a vast number of pre-qualified buyers, most of which are going to be in the U.S., maybe about 80% of them. And they have a true need to grow their infrastructure. A lot of them are actually doing like fiber to the home projects currently. So there's kind of a sense of like public service that you're doing, because if you have the IPs and you're not using them, there are companies who really need them in order to deliver internet services. And it's not even always going to be a big ISP. Lots of times we work with regional ISPs and like telephone companies in rural areas that are trying to get access trying to get internet access to people that don't have internet access or have really slow internet access. So there's a really good feeling that kind of comes into play at the end of this, where you actually helped a company who's just trying to help people get internet access. So the public service part of it is really nice. It makes us feel good about what we're doing. And then every company we work with is always, we always make sure they have ethical use case. And if they're outside of the country, we ensure that there's no sanctions, and then they have like kind of a good business model, because at the end of the day, we're involved with every transaction as well. So our legal kind of looks over every company to ensure that there's no red flags. So throughout the transaction, or before we start a transaction, a payment is collected from the buyer, and there's two methods of doing that. So for Brainerd Group, we actually don't mind either way. We offer two methods because we realize that not everybody wants to kind of transact in the same way. The first one is escrow.com. It does offer peace of mind in that there's a third party that actually handles escrow for a business, like for a living, that's their business. We'll initiate the transaction. Both buyer and seller will get to see the terms of the transaction. It'll have a very clear milestone that'll state, once the transaction completes and the block has been transferred, then the funds are released. Great platform. We use them all the time. There is a fee associated with it, just under 1%. So some people don't want to use that either on the buyer or seller side. So in that case, we actually offer our services, which we basically created out of necessity. We don't necessarily like being an escrow company, and nor are we an escrow company, but a lot of our customers were already customers. We were approved vendors for them. So they would just pay us. They would just pay us via wire transfer. So we actually have a designated client funds account where we'll keep the funds until a transaction completes. And we'll ensure that obviously funds are collected prior to the transaction starting. Once the transaction completes, we'll disperse funds to yourself and ourselves at the same time. So those are the two options, and depending on which one you're more comfortable with, we can get you set up in both and actually direct you throughout that process. So the entire transfer process takes roughly 2 to 3 weeks. Once we've got blocks to a point where you're ready to sell them, right? That could take anywhere from, a day to months, depending on strategy for readdressing. But once we're at a point where we're ready to sell the blocks, it's about 2 to 3 weeks. So the buyer will have a chance to review the block. We'll show them the blacklist report. The agreement will get signed. That could take a few days depending on their legal process. The buyer will fund, takes a couple days. You'll go ahead and submit a transfer ticket, and then the buyer will submit a transfer ticket. Now, during this process, our team will send you guys a step-by-step guide on how everything's going to work, and we'll check in every couple of days to make sure that that everything's going smoothly. But essentially, what will happen is you submit a transfer ticket. Aaron will start to review, which is the next step, the RIR review process. They'll ask you guys to pay a small fee. I think it's a $300 admin fee. Once they've approved the transfer, they'll ask you to sign and notarize an Aaron document that confirms you're transferring these assets out of your name. Once that's submitted, it will then go to the buyer. If the buyer has any fees, they pay the fees. If not, then HESS updates within a day or two, and then the transfer is completed. State of the market, as we mentioned earlier, it's quite strong. COVID actually accelerated the market very quickly. Reason being was twofold. One, the normal companies that were looking to readdress and sell assets, such as schools and enterprises, they had contingency plans, or I guess they had to reassess their planning and move resources to COVID. So there was less inventory available in the market, and still is, because of the fact that everybody had to change their plans to focus on COVID. And then on the flip side, companies that are buying IPs, such as ISPs and hosting providers, needed more IP addresses because of COVID to support all the users that were working from home. So it created a really hot market in a time where there was chaos in the world. IPv4 was resilient, and in fact grew at a significant rate. So at the moment, we're looking at, $22 to $23 per IP price range, pretty easily selling at those rates. We have a special group rate that we worked out with the HESS Consortium with Brian's help of 4% of the total transaction price. If you choose to use escrow, typically we'll try to split the fee between buyer and seller. So that's something to consider. And then, as I mentioned before, there's a small fee of $300 that Aaron charges just as an admin fee, because they're a nonprofit and they have got to pay the bills somehow. All right, and I think I'm done here. I'll hand it off to Todd, right?
Great. Thanks, guys. So I'm just going to share a little bit about my experience and kind of how the whole thing took shape here. Like I said, I started talking to Brian maybe fall of 2019. At the time, I didn't really have a specific project in mind. It was just something I never really thought of, and he started talking about it, and it made sense to me to at least consider how I might use available resources. Resources are tight on campus, and if you can make use of something that's otherwise just sitting there, in a dusty closet per se. Why would we not do that? So it was just something, at the time I just thought of in that capacity. What accelerated the process for us was, as Brian said, it was a major project. We're looking at a transition from one ERP to another. And the implementation costs are one time, not necessarily operational increases, but certainly one-time costs are significant on a project like that. So something like this fits perfectly because, by the nature of it, you sell it once and it's done. You can't fit this into operational costs and offsetting ongoing expenses. It's a project. You do it once and then you're done with it. And so it just really, really fit. And so we were, to me, it makes a significant impact. I don't want to let go of a resource like this for something that I'm going to replace in 3 or 4 years. Maybe new wireless access points. That wouldn't really be the thing for me that would make this worth it. But when we're talking about transitioning from one ERP to another, that's a 15, maybe 20-year commitment. This really does move the needle for our campus. And it was something that, as we started planning for this, I felt like I needed to get strategic vision set with the president and CFO so that I had their support. And I did. We have a new president here who was interested in moving to a new ERP. We had a CFO who was frustrated with antiquated business processes. And I just, it included this as a part of a path forward. It doesn't solve the problem, but it's a path forward that we wouldn't have had otherwise. So, that's kind of the purpose of why we pulled the trigger on it. And I will say I had a network admin prior who was not very thrilled about this idea. Our IPs were kind of scattered throughout the range, clustered throughout our whole 300 or 65,000 IPs. And, there was some hesitation there. With a staff transition, it really was the perfect storm for us to be able to get this done. So, the new guy was willing to do it. And I felt like it was something that needed to be done for our campus. Everybody was willing to do what needed to be done. So I reached out actually to Brian. I was trying to figure out, how do I do this? What's the process like? My CFO was asking me, is this a formal RFP? Do we need to vet 4 or 5 different vendors? Once Brian and I talked and we had an agreement already in place with HESS, we knew that Brander Group had already been vetted. So, it was something that we could proceed with some confidence that many people have looked at this company and found their services to be reputable, their prices to be competitive. The service fees were lower than what I was finding elsewhere. So, that was a really good, it seemed like a good partnership. And so I reached out to Jake. We started working through the process, and I will say that Brander Group was very easy to work with the whole way through, start to finish. They give you clear step by step by step. They walk with you. It's not just giving you the directions and letting you go. They were on calls with our vendors who were helping us. We had controllers we needed to move off of an IP range, and they hopped on a call to help us resolve some issues that we were having there. I think they just really helped us know the process, right? They do it all the time. I've never done this before. So, and you only have it, when you're selling significant blocks, you're not going to do this very often. And so no one really had much of experience with this, but Brander Group really did help. This is one just big Brander Group commercial, but I'll just tell you straight up, we couldn't have done it without them. It would have been too confusing. Let's see. I did have to overcome some objections from IT staff. There's a lot of steps to this, dealing with the blacklists, trying to cluster your IP use, and other things that we needed to communicate to our internet service providers to make sure we were broadcasting the right IP range. There was a lot of steps in there. And those were all things that, were step by step. We would get just weekly calls from one of Jake's team members, just to make sure that everything was going. For us, there was a planning phase, and Brian said, I think it was Brian said, or maybe it was Jake, that there's a process before you decide, and then there's a process once you decide. It's kind of lockstep. It's pretty simple going forward. It's all the planning on the front end that we took a little bit of time. We started our conversation in mid-November, and we spent pretty much almost the rest of the year, just planning. And but once we pulled the trigger, it really was just a very quick process. This is a good question. I've later here, I'll just skip to the lessons learned. One of the gotchas, we sold 3 different blocks. We sold a block of 17, which is about half of our block. And then we sold 2 blocks of 20, which is about 4,000. And what we found, you get so many emails from Jake's group and from Aaron and from our ISP, and the email subject lines, if you're paying close attention, you can tell them apart. But it's really easy to get them all confused. And from my perspective, the thing that if I could do it all over again, I would have sold the block of 17, finish that sale, then come back and sell a 20, finish that sale, come back and do another 20. It's no slight on Jake's group. They did a good job of communicating, but when things were moving so fast and things looked so the same from my perspective, because I don't have the context and experience on it, it all jumbled together. And so that was the biggest thing. And the only other gotcha that we had in the whole process was only at the very, very end, when it came to that final request to Aaron to do the changeover. One of the clients ended up being international, and so we used Ripe instead of Aaron. So that was just one more signature page, one more notary. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was a little deal, but it was the only other hiccup in the whole process. We did use escrow.com for the cider of 17. It's a lot of money changing hands. We just wanted to make sure that went well, and it was peace of mind, as Jake said. For the other ones, for the smaller ones, we did wire transfer. They went just fine. We probably could have done wire transfer for the whole thing. We just didn't. So, we had our share of things that we needed to collapse in our IP range, like Brian said. The printers, security cameras, other devices that, maybe from students that, some of their devices that we statically assigned to make them work well in residence halls. We needed to transition some of that stuff. But for the gain, it was a really painless process. I'll
echo a lot of what Todd has said, and we did 3 different sales. We started with a smaller block of a 19, and then which was 8,000 addresses, sold another 19 of 8,000 addresses, and then we sold a /18 of 16,000 addresses. So all 3 of those added up to 32,000 addresses in total. And one of the things that I asked Jake about a number of times through our process is, does it really matter what block size we sell? Is there a higher price if we're selling a bigger block, or can we charge a higher price if we're selling smaller blocks? And it really doesn't matter. It's a commodity. The price per address is pretty static throughout all of those ranges. But as Todd talked about, each transaction is some work involved and some things to coordinate. We did all of ours in series rather than in parallel. And yeah, Todd, I don't envy you with trying to keep track which transaction was which transaction. The one thing I would really, really strongly recommend is keeping your remaining IP address range contiguous.
Yeah.
So for example, you wouldn't want to have your full range of 65,000 addresses and then sell a chunk out of the middle of it. And then you're broadcasting through your ISP our IP range is this addresses, and then skip some, and then add some other addresses. So starting wherever you have your most critical assets, toward the front of your range, toward the back of your range, whatever that is, kind of pick an end of your IP range and then start working forward or backward from there, so that as you work with your ISP to tell them, now don't broadcast this full range, but only address this remaining, or only broadcast this remaining part left, keeping that with one single range to broadcast. It's not impossible to do otherwise. It's just more complexity that we didn't want to add to our environment. So we tried to keep everything contiguous, which has been helpful. And like Todd, my infrastructure director, who's great, is a little less enthusiastic about this process than I am. And it can be a not insignificant amount of work. We probably spent 6 months doing readdressing and changes. And we're probably not done with sales. We've got some additional work that we need to do before we can do an additional sale. But I think we're really, really safe if we leave ourselves with 16,000 addresses, even if we do full network address translation and assign public IP addresses to every device on our network. I think we'd all have a really hard time adding up all of our servers and all of our switches and all of our access points and all of our printers and all of our everything else, plus employee computers, plus student computers and phones, trying to add up to a point where we say 16,000 IP addresses isn't sufficient for us. That's a big task. So I think ultimately that's where we're considering going to, is ourselves with 16,000 addresses, and then reevaluate from where we are there.
Yeah, I would add one thing. I forgot. There was a little gotcha, a technical gotcha, and if anything is going to happen, it's going to happen to me, kind of thing. We have 2 internet service providers, and one of them, there was a typo in the IP broadcast range. So we just came in one day, and they had made the transition from broadcasting one set of IPs to another, and they had set the wrong numbers, and we weren't getting any service out of that IP address or out of that internet service provider. So that was a little thing. I would say that's the measure twice and cut once philosophy. Just got to double check with those folks just to make 100% sure that they got it right, because that did cause, it was 30 minutes of what the heck, well, why is this happening? But we really did, it caused a brief disruption, a little bit of panic, because to me, I thought, did I just break the internet, for the college, and ended up being nothing of the sort. It was just a typo, but it took a little while to track it down.
Yeah, so overall, very, very, it's interesting. Todd and I didn't coordinate all together closely on our sales, but I think the issues that people hit and the decision points and the complexities are all very, very similar. Most of our schools are so alike in so many ways that I think all the things that Todd and I have mentioned have been echoed by other schools that I've talked with who've been through a similar process. So I think all the potential gotchas, all the work involved in readdressing, all of those other things are all pretty common things that we've all seen and heard before, and are pretty well known at this point, as we've had so many schools go through the process. So that's all we have in terms of information delivery. So want to open it up again in the chat, or feel free to speak out, anybody who has any questions about any part of the process. I see we've got one in the chat. Andy's asking, is a single Class C range of 256 addresses too small to consider for a sale? Jake, do you want to address that?
No, it's not. That's actually the smallest block size you are allowed to transfer within the regions, and we've got plenty of demand for those size blocks.
Okay, great. Well, I'm very interested in checking that out. So if we could follow up sometime after this, I'd like to look at that.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
If you want to put your email in the chat, I can just shoot you a quick follow-up. Oh,
Okay.
there you go. There's my email right there.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. While we continue taking any additional questions, I'll go ahead and move to showing the contact information so everybody can have time to capture that.
Okay. Got your email. And then also one thing that I did want to mention, which is kind of I want to say maybe probably something to consider we've ran into, is if you've never done BGP, if nobody on your team understands how to change a BGP announcement, both with the provider and on your router, just know that that's going to be required. And a couple of the calls that I've done with some of the schools we worked with, they had no clue how to do it, so we had to get on the phones with their upstream provider, which would be one of the usually 2 internet service providers they use, just to learn, or just to have them change an announcement, and then also you got to change it on your router, and that cutoff time will require like a blackout window for the school, because you don't want to cut off any like critical services. So that's something that we will work with you on, but that's something to consider as well.
Okay, in our case, our 256 block is not used at all, so I don't think we have to worry about the BGP aspect of that. So.
Gotcha. I see you guys got a /23, it looks like.
Right, that sounds correct.
Yeah. Cool.
Any questions from anybody else at this time?
I would just say one more
David.
little just piece of advice. One of the things we had to sort of after the fact, we didn't line up where the money was going to land in our budget. And we have rules about money sort of going back to the big pot of money after, if it's not used, within a certain amount of time. And so I had to work with our CFO. And that's something maybe to think about on the front end, but where's that money going to land? Because an ERP transition is not something you do overnight. It takes some time. And so that money has to outlive a single operating budget. Mm-hmm. So just, it's a small thing, but it's a thing on the front end. Just get things organized so that the accounting folks know where to put the money when it comes in.
Yeah, great point.
I've got a question.
Last call for any questions.
I got a question for Jake. This is David from Mount Holyoke College, and I'm just thinking about the rhythm of the academic year, and the folks are probably all trying to do this during the low periods of the year. Is there any contention for resources on your side that we should be aware of if we're looking at this as a summer project, as a winter break project? What do you see as the best way to coordinate this work?
No, we always have resources to assist, and there's always demand. What I would say is, if you're planning on doing this as a summer readdress project, it's still, I think it's still beneficial to get involved in a conversation well in advance, because there's a lot more than just doing the work as we had discussed. There's strategy about readdressing, blacklisting, understanding how the process works, contracts. Most legal departments and schools will take a couple of weeks or more to review a contract and just redline it. So it's better to get involved sooner than later, and then we can do a reverse timeline, because, for instance, some of the schools we work with, they want to get the money right at the end of or the beginning of the fiscal year, because they want to be able to spend it. So they want to have it, right July 1st, as an example. So there's just some reverse timelines you want to set in accordance with the process and how things kind of unfold.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd say in our case, we engaged with Jake and Brander Group at the beginning of our process, and then we had a 6-month process to do all of our readdressing and move that around before we could free up a block to sell. So that's all part of the standard timeline and process for this.
Yeah, because one thing that we'll do is we'll also look at your IP usage, and we'll take the time to suggest to you maybe how to readdress, and then hear how you want to do it, and then just come up with a strategy together. And that that process in and of itself takes a few weeks just to build a strategy.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks everybody. Really appreciate you jumping on today, and you've got our contact information for all three of us on here. So if you have other questions or follow up after the call, feel free to let us know. And this session is being recorded, so if you want to share that out to anybody else on your team or at your institution, this will be shared out through the HESS website in the coming days. Thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
All right, thanks guys. Take care.